Greetings. My name is Heather Vermeulen, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Trans Revolutions. The virtual symposium is co-sponsored by Wesleyan University's Center for the Humanities and the Barnard Center for Research on Women. To leave as much time as possible for the artists, I'm going to keep my remarks brief. First, my deepest gratitude goes to Hope Decter and Eve Kausch at BCRW for offering your energy and expertise to make this online event possible. To Natasha Korda and Erin Savage at the Center for the Humanities, thank you for your thoughtfulness and support throughout. Special thanks as well to our co-sponsors and co-conspirators who are listed on the event's webpage. And it also features, or that might be down now, but there are bios on the artists that'll be back up before too long. Maybe not right now though. Because Trans Revolutions was originally scheduled to take place in Connecticut, Hope suggested that we call attention to an anti-trans lawsuit that's happening in the state. The Alliance Defending Freedom, a right-wing Christian organization with a long history of anti-queer and anti-abortion work, is representing 3 cisgender girls in a lawsuit against Connecticut schools. The plaintiffs are challenging the state's policy of allowing girls who are trans to participate in girls' athletics without having to prove any medical intervention. So we'll be posting a link to the ACLU's information about this case on the event page. It is an honor and a joy to thank the participating artists for their enthusiasm and care at this disorienting and devastating time. First up will be photographer Texas Isaiah, followed by multidisciplinary artist Vic Quezada, filmmaker Elliot Montague, live performance and theater artist Emma Frankland, and film and video installation artist Tourmaline. A group discussion and Q&A will follow their individual presentations. It was Tourmaline who suggested that instead of canceling Trans Revolutions, we collaborate with BCRW to reimagine the event as a virtual symposium inspired by the frameworks of disability justice and mutual aid. Each of the artists presenting this afternoon exemplifies the critical work that creative practice and revolutionary care can and must perform. Thank you all, and now I'll turn it over to Texas Isaiah.
I was muted, sorry. Thank you to everyone who made this possible. I really appreciate the fact that we can continue to do this. And so for this 15-minute presentation, I will be discussing the process leading up to a new project that has been in the works for the last 2 years or so. And the project is called Flowers at Your Feet. And it serves as an affirmation towards men of different experiences, as well as an integration of contemporary perspectives surrounding masculinity and manhood. The project is not yet complete, but the images will continue to be taken in New York City, Los Angeles, Oakland, Atlanta, and New Orleans within interior and outdoor sites. So I'll just go through, is the slide up? My slide's up. Well, if it is, I'm gonna read a quote from an amazing artist, Fatima Jamal.
Hold on one second.
Oh.
Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna load up your slideshow, okay?
Okay, sorry.
All right, 1 second, just yet.
Yeah, no problem. Awesome. I need to full screen. Awesome. So we're just going to go to the next slide. This reads, once upon a time, I thought representation to be such a valuable thing, but this project, she's referring to her project, No Fats, No Femmes, has revealed to me that my mirror and my own gaze is much more significant. Representation, don't get me wrong, is a wonderful thing. Parentheses, great gowns, in as much as it temporarily satisfies, but what comes after representation. That quote is by Fatima Jamal. Her Instagram is Fat Femme. You should go follow her. She's an amazing filmmaker. But you know, her quote sort of lends a lens on how I've been thinking about sort of curating this project, Flowers at Your Feet. which has been in the making for 2 years, and has shifted drastically within the last year, because I was unwell for 5 months last year. And so it gave me a lot of time to do a lot of research and to really dig into what I want, but also as a community, what the trans masculine people need from images. And so we're going to go to the next slide. Awesome. So the way I approach my work is by considering as many lived experiences as possible. I figured instead of solely compiling and printing a bunch of images that would influence the project, I will also create my own mood board full of images that I've taken. So when it came time for me to pursue this journey, I found myself back home in New York City, and I had asked several Black trans people to meet me in Prospect Park. And so these are one of the images that I took during that time. I believe it was June or July of last year. So this is Raquel Willis. And so I was examining what it meant to convene within a space which is supposed to offer us solitude, but can simultaneously also serve us as much chaos, right? Because parks serve as a space to engage with relaxation. And so, with actually shooting this project, the project began with Black trans women and femmes, because I thought if I am to speak about masculinity and manhood, I was thinking about acknowledging the conclusion of what it can mean to, I guess, contribute and produce a better landscape for them to exist in, and to sort of work through, what also what masculine people also need and need to work through as well, right? And so this is the kind of first maybe mood board image that sort of guided me into the project. And one thing that I thoroughly enjoy about this image is that, as much as I do enjoy the imagery that has been produced of Black trans people, even within the last 5 years, a lot of those images are taken by, white, cishet, mostly masculine photographers. And so I'm always questioning, what does it look like to create Black trans images, that are taken by Black trans people. And so this image is very interesting because I think that when I was producing this image and when Raquel and I were sort of trying to, figure out how to, create an image in which, can offer her some comfort. This image is sort of a master image to me because this is something that I can print out and put over my fireplace. I don't have a fireplace, but it's nice to think about, right? And so when I'm thinking about producing images of Black trans people, I'm also thinking about where these images can exist in public space, obviously with the consent of the sitter. And so we're going to go to the next image now, the next slide. And so that previous image of Raquel was taken, I believe, in June and July. And so this image, this is of Lex Kennedy. This was actually taken beforehand, I believe, in April in Exposition Park by USC here in Los Angeles. And so one of the other things I was thinking about was sort of how to integrate a connectivity between a sitter and myself, especially since a lot of people I do consider as friends. And also, again, what do what is the desire within trans masculine images? Because a lot of them, or a lot of the images that I've seen in public and digital domains are of mostly white trans men. And if it is of brown and Black trans men, it is sort of like we are on display of showing our bodies, and people are consuming our scars and all of these things that I do find is maybe somewhat necessary, but I also feel like there should be more images that are produced that center more care and intention. And so this image sort of lends as a potential dialogue of what that can possibly look like. You know, the visual narrator behind the camera is sort of physically lending themselves to a sitter and sort of promoting an image of relaxation and calmness, again, in a public space, in a park. So that, you know, even if there is potential chaos or a potential display of violence that we may experience, we're also able to see eye to eye in some capacity and protect each other within that moment. We're going to go to the next image. And so this image, this is Dash Porter on the left and Devin Nisi on the right. This image was taken in August 2019, so last year. And so the two prior images that I showed you served as mood board images and sort of came into this. And this is titled A Vibrant Gospel. And so when I was producing this image with Dash and Devin, you know, I thought about the importance of to sort of reimagining what trans masculine bodies would look like within the pages of magazines. So I was thinking more of an editorial aspect to this image. And I think what's interesting about this part of the project, which is the second half, is, you know, the second half of the project focuses on ways Black trans men are cultivating community and relief amongst one another. And one thing that I wanted to sort of concentrate on is that I don't want to produce, I don't know, I think images do lie, but I think my intention and how I'm approaching the images, I don't want to serve something that is unreal, right? And so I didn't want to create these sort of visual images of how should I say this? I guess I just didn't want it to seem like everyone is in community and happy and, you know, all of this thing, because I think amongst specifically trans masculine individuals, we're trying to figure out a way to be with one another in community. So a lot of the folks on this set, I think it was 11 of us, some of them had never met each other before. And so, you know, I wanted to approach this again in a very realistic way where I am capturing these two people who had never met each other before and sort of offering them space to, you know, be as they are. So, you know, not asking them to smile if they don't want to smile, not asking them to sort of engage intimately if they don't want to. So sort of lending an autonomy to these individuals so they can be in the frame as they wish to be. We're going to move on to the next slide. And this is another example of what I'm speaking about in terms of, you know, two sitters engaging with each other when they have not met each other before, prior, or they're, you know, developing a friendship with one another. And this image is titled "Returning to Our Flowers." And if you notice, there is sort of a slight, a little homage to Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill in this image, which is some of my research that I did, you know, for those 5 months. I was on bed rest, and you know what I really loved about their work was that they did speak about masculinity and manhood, but they also sort of focused on, you know, misogyny. They did focus on sexism, and so even with looking through, you know, their works, I was figuring out like what is needed to sort of fill in, you know, these gaps that are missing because there wasn't enough space, time, and resources for them to sort of dive deeply into, their own works, especially since that was during the time of the AIDS epidemic. So I have 3 minutes left. So, I think with Flowers at Your Feet, a lot of the conversations I'm, trying to offer is, how can we all sort of talk about masculinity and manhood that isn't primarily centered on the conversations of cis men? How can trans men and non-binary masked individuals contribute to these conversations, as well as how can we insert ourselves within a visual archive that truly serves us, right? And then also the conclusion, how can those visual archives serve to build a better landscape for women and femmes? So yes, that is the end of my presentation. Got done early.
Heather, do you want to introduce the speaker?
Yes, sure. Give me 1 second. Okay, so up next is multidisciplinary artist Vic Quezada. So Vic, are you live?
I'm live. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I wanted to start off by thanking Heather for organizing this and making it happen. Also, I wanted to thank Hope for taking care of the technical aspects of this. I'm I'm actually really excited to be able to participate this and be amidst some fantastic and amazing artists, Texas, Emma, Elliot, and Tourmaline. It's really a privilege, and yeah, I'm happy that we can get this event going, amidst the surreal times that we are in right now. So, what I want to do is just also acknowledge that I am on occupied territory right now. The land that I'm on is the Pakumtup and Nipmuc, and I'd like to just pay respect to past, present, and future peoples. So what I'd like to talk about today is, just sort of some of the aspects of my art, some of the things that I actually really enjoy in my art and art practice. Some of the things that continually are coming up are flora and fauna, and as well as other like fabricated objects. These fabricated objects, as some of you may have seen, is like bricks, shopping carts, rope, and so on. So basically, what I am is I am a gleaner. So what I do is I go into, I'll go into places and spaces like tag sales, or I'll go to flea markets, or another favorite places that I source is Facebook Marketplace. And I like to look at objects. I mean, I think that objects basically, there's history behind objects, and in these objects, they reveal a lot of the past. And so I'll generally incorporate these objects with, like I said, flora and fauna. And can we see the first slide, please?
Sure, I'm loading it up right now.
Okay, great. So in the slide, there's this like reference that you'll begin to see in my work. It's corn, and basically corn in indigenous culture, the Aztec indigenous culture, is referenced in Aztec mythology, and there are there are two gods. One is Chicomecoatl and the other god is Senteotl. And these are actually a dual gendered god. It is one entity, but there are two, they're dual, dual gendered gods. So they're the god of agriculture, and as well as they're prevalent in like all things of liveliness. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. So in this this particular work is called monoecious fruit. So monoecious is a term that actually means it's a scientific term, and it actually means it has two sexes on one body of a plant. And ironically, corn actually is a monoecious fruit. It is both masculine and feminine. So it, you know, it also references back to Aztec indigenous culture, how they also believed it to be that there was dual gendered in corn. So, you know, I found this parallel in it, and that's sort of why it continues to come up and is referenced in my work. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right, and in particular, this piece that I made, cart one, you know, I talk, or I sort of bring up a lot in my work about displacement. There's like displacement of identity and land, and trying to reconcile this through objects, and also just like, you know, the conversations that can arise from the sculpture that I've created. So what I did in this particular piece is I took some like hard clay material for the bottom, and I sculpted it for the base, and in the bed of the cart I put soil in there, and in doing so I planted seeds that I had sourced specifically from a location in Mexico, northern Mexico, Chihuahua. So I took these seeds and I began to grow them in my studio. We can go to the next one, please. So much this piece right here is I think it's thank Omeotl, it's Friday. This is a referencing to an indigenous Aztec god as well, and in indigenous Aztec mythology and beliefs, you'll actually run into a lot of dual gendered gods. And what this piece was just basically an offering to the god, which is Omeotl, another dual gendered god, which actually lives in the cosmos. So this is sort of what fueled this type of project. Could we go to the next, please? This is something also, I think, you know, there's always this like, there's just something, this continuance of objects, right? I actually got this frame I found it, I want to say it was like at a flea market, and it's actually a frame it's from the 1800s. And what I did is I took a photo of myself, and I incorporated like colonial themes sort of, and also thinking about like the body. So basically then the subject body basically is what I did. So I sort of create this like tension, and also like bringing up like a, you know, a queer non-binary body, sort of to kind of bring the tension of colonialism, and also this queer identity, indigenous. Yeah. Can we go to the next one, please? And this is something that actually, this is my most recent work. I actually just finished up with this body of work. What I did is I've been participating in, I've been a fellow at the Latinx Project, and I was able to go to Texas, and I'm actually originally from El Paso, Texas. So what I did is I decided to, there's this like object here, which is like, it's It's called Ozomatli. I built this monkey, but this like monkey actually is also a reference to an indigenous god, but this monkey is actually a corn seeder. So I loaded this machine up with with corn seed. And I traveled, there are these like locations in El Paso, they're missions. Basically, these missions were garrisons for Catholic, like the Catholic faith, right? And people who settled in the area. They're sort of like an old type of like border marker. So if one might say, it kind of could stand for like the old, like a border of sorts along along the El Paso and Mexico border. So I took this corn seeder and I basically walked 9 miles to each of each of these missions. And along the route, it was sort of a meditative practice, right? It's slowing down time, it's slowing down, and I'm able to see different things along the route. And I think that sort of it just something I've been thinking about is like somebody actually, let me just go back and say this. Somebody actually commented on the work as a glorified dog walk, and I thought that was actually really humorous. This actual this performance that I did. It's a performance, it's a video performance, if I didn't say that already. And I actually thought it was, in some ways, it kind of felt like that. It actually felt like I was really taking my time through these places and investigating these sites, but it's like kind of contrary to the way that we like see things and do things in society today, because we are like constantly like overstimulated with media. So in some way I feel like it's a way to like step back and like really slow things down. So yeah, these are things that I often feel like are also coming up in my work, is like a slowness in the work, and it's becoming more so, it feels like it's becoming more so deliberate to just sort of be counter to instant gratification. Like I almost even feel like instant gratification is a colonial concept, but I don't know. That seems like a hard argue, but anyways. So yeah, yeah, I guess that is basically concludes my thoughts around my artwork.
Okay.
Hey, Heather.
Yes, hi. Hi. Are you, oh, okay, great. So before we move on to Elliot Montague, who's the next speaker, I just wanted to say that the website is back up. There were some issues with it earlier, but it's up, and so you can access the live stream there. And the captioning link there is there as well, and additional info about the event and the participants, as well as the question submission directions. So I'll turn it over to Elliot Montague now. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just so honored to be part of this. And I was talking with Vic yesterday about how this actually ended up being really amazing, that I feel like so many more people can access the work today in light of having to go online. So thank you to all the artists, and thank you to Hope and to Heather, who I know have been organizing this for months. So today I'll be talking a little bit about my most recent film, which is temporarily online through tonight, because it hasn't been technically released yet. It's playing in festivals, but of course they're being postponed. And the film is called Light on a Path Follow, and it's a short narrative film that actually features Vic as the lead actor, who plays Joaquin, a trans person who's pregnant in the mid-90s in New England. We filmed it on Pocumtuck territory in 2018 of August 2018 in West Cummington, Massachusetts. And the film really envisions queer and trans bodies as conduits to other spiritual worlds. So if you don't mind just starting the slideshow right now, Hope, and then you can go to the second one if that's
Turning it on right now.
Okay, great. So I'll just begin speaking. The film explores transmasculine pregnancy, queer of color birth work, and connections to ancestral spirits through an intimate relationship to nature. Pregnancy and birthing are often assumed as a woman's experience, but the film expands who's able to be pregnant. And maybe if you could just go back one slide, Hope, thank you. However, the film is not simply trying to redefine the pregnant body as a masculine or transmasculine experience, but it explores pregnancy as a mode of thinking about transition to other spiritual worlds or other kinds of connections. So I think of pregnancy not only bringing life into the world, but also into oneself. And for a trans person, this sort of transitioning can be really powerful in terms of finding like a sense of home within oneself. So today I'll be discussing a few themes with which the film engages. Next slide, please, Hope, thank you. So Jacob Lau first coined the term transtemporality in 2016 in his UCLA dissertation Between the Times, Transtemporality and Historical Representation. And Lau describes the term as both an experiential affect and a method of reading trans narratives against normative notions of sex, gender, race, class, sexuality, and nationality. So essentially thinking of transgender through post-colonial queer and theorizations of time and history that really push against and suggest alternatives to purely linear temporalities. And so, so historically, you know, the notion of transitioning or trans narratives that we've seen in film is generally understood as like medicalized or pathologized, so like transitioning from one gender to the other. And the way that I like to really think about transitioning is more through like birth or death or pregnancy and childbirth. And then how might non-traditional modes of transition on screen, such as transmasculine pregnancy, offer viewers new visual language for comprehending gender as non-binary on a spectrum. Next slide, please. So one theme that we were really engaging with in the film was transcestors. So, you know, the idea of putting trans and ancestors together, who might be people of our past, who are no longer physically with us, so the spectral, but also perhaps spirits from the future or part of our own selves. And how are the characters and we as viewers both maybe haunted and at the same time guided and cared for by these spirits? And how does this such relationship collapse time and space within film? Also thinking about like different visual notions of passing. So whether it be like the passing of the soul from the material physical realm in the process of death, or the passing of certain performances or notions of gender. So like the death of our past genders, the birth of new ones, and how that's very secular. Next slide. And these are all stills from the film. So hopefully folks had a chance to watch it. And again, it will be available through tonight. Also the idea of home and place. So how can film manifest the contradictory affects of trans and queer experiences in relation to home, landscape, and belonging? Many of my films kind of really depict like the singular body within landscape. And within land, within nature, and how might one find a sense of home within the tension between maybe one's interiority, of our interior landscape, and then the exteriority of the forces at play. So with this film, we're also thinking about the surrendering of the body to the unpredictability of life transitions, which is in part that the admission that the body is an affective body. And by that, I mean that it's always in relation to other bodies. We're always in relation to other bodies. And that is, how is one's embodiment a manifestation of past or ancestral knowledge? And in preparing to die and in taking hormones, pregnancy, giving birth, the body will always know what to do, the wisdom of the body. And in surrendering to this, we might find a sense of home. So with these themes in mind, I'd like to bring in two really important film movements that have been very influential to my work over the past 2 decades, and particularly to Light on a Path Follow, if you don't mind advancing the slides. The first movement is New Trans Cinema, and this is a still from Reese Ernst and Doctors Shigon Rogue in 2012. And New Trans Cinema takes roots from New Queer Cinema, which was a term coined by Ruby B. Rich in 1992 to describe the recent influx of films made by queer artists, that particularly take on like a hybrid genre and style. And so it's kind of like the queering of form, really. And it's interesting to think about how the power that a story can hold when it's not easily locatable, or when it's not locatable within like a specific time, space, or genre. And then furthermore, the power that a particular body or person or body on a screen can hold when one is not easily legible or locatable. And so New Queer Cinema was really questioning why we need to think beyond simple trans and queer visibility and representation. And so New Trans Cinema now, like, 20, 30 years later, I think is sort of this sort of beautiful, like almost reinsurgence of New Queer Cinema. And a lot of the folks that I know that are making work right now are definitely, I mean, I know that Texas Isaiah nodded to Marlon Riggs' like Tongues of Tide. There's a lot of conversation, almost intergenerational conversation that's happening from works that we may have learned, 20 years ago, and now how it's influencing the way we make work now. And the other movement that's been particularly influential, if you don't mind advancing the slide, is slow cinema. So I really like to bring this into my classroom, and I like to kind of allow students to experience what emerges from a screen when we really are given an extended time to look at a moving image, a slower moving image. And I'm specifically influenced by the work of Thai queer filmmaker Pichapong Rosakun, and this is a still from his film Uncle Boon Me, Who Can Recall His Past Lives in 2010. And he frames a lot of his stories through Thai mythology and the thin barrier between the material, the physical world, and also like the spiritual world. And in this scene here, there's an ancestor who's kind of materializing with the family as they're eating dinner. So if you could advance this slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit of background of light and how it manifested over the last 2 years. And as a white transmasculine director, it was really important to me that this project was collaborative and that was collective from the beginning, from the way that we developed it to then even through production, and then now with the film's aftermath as we begin to share it with the world. So I had a bare bones script, and then are there any more slides, Hope? It should be.
Hey, Elliot, I'm just having a quick issue with the slides and bringing it back up. So it'll be back up in about a minute.
I'll continue talking.
Okay.
So so it was really important to me to approach this in a very collective way of filmmaking, and to approach filmmaking as more of a horizontal approach, really kind of dismantling like the hierarchy, I think the white supremacy, and also the patriarchy that film has, that so much of film is a foundation that's derived from when actually, when Hollywood developed, even before Hollywood developed. And so Vic and I really started working together early on, and I had a lot of people starting to commit to the project, and then two very important people, Vic, of course, who played the lead actor, and then Lucia Leandro Jimeno, who plays the midwife birth spirit. The three of us really worked together to develop the story. And specifically, it was through their own development of the characters, and characters, of course, like bring structure to film. So that was a very important phase that we went through together. So if you don't mind just advancing one slide, Hope. So Vic Quezada, as you know, is a friend of mine, and we met in LA, and it was really exciting. We kind of moved out here to Western Massachusetts around the same time, and this was Vic's first time acting in the film, in a film, but of course they had like performance art background, so it was really great to tap into that energy. And Vic brought their own backstory to the character of Joaquin, and that really was then a beautiful conversation that kind of unfolded between like Vic themselves and then this fictional character Joaquin. The other key collaborator is Lucia Leandro Jimeno. If you could just advance the slide. And he's been a very integral part of the film, and he's been in my queer family for about 20 years. We went to Hampshire College together in the late 90s, and we've worked on several film projects in the past. And it was especially exciting to work with him in Light because he's the director of the Queer Trans People of Color Birthwork Project, and he's a birth worker himself. And so he's also a writer. So it was this beautiful collaboration that we had between the three of us. And if you could just advance the slide, him being the director of the Cutie Buck Birthwork Project, now that the film is finished, he's going to be able to then lead workshops and use the film as sort of a platform for conversation with other queer and Cutie Buck birth workers, particularly around the country. If you could just advance the slide. So the three of us worked a great deal through the rehearsal process to really discover their characters. And this was them on set after a 16-hour day when we shot the birth scene. It was until like 7 in the morning, and totally exhausted, but just elated by the whole process. And this unique time together really offered the actors the opportunity to bring parts of their own life to the story, and really also uncovering who these characters might be for each other, and then their relationship to their own relationships to the characters. And if you could just advance the slide. And I wanted to just reflect upon this last scene here, which is the birth scene. And it was really important to us to show birth in a different way than many traditional narratives or films show birth, which is often like in a hospital, or like it's this woman screaming, or it's, with doctors. And we wanted to really kind of decolonialize that on screen. And so this birth scene is really about an intergenerational connection between the past, the present, and the future. So again, kind of going back to transtemporality, where it's non-linear. And the spirit, Joaquin, and the baby are then somewhat of a triptych here. And within this sort of transtemporality, the spirit or the birth worker is perhaps like an ancestor of the future, or perhaps even part of Joaquin. And this scene really encapsulates the spirit and Joaquin's relationship. So, and kind of really highlights the mutual aid that the theme of mutual aid throughout the entire film. And that really brings me to this idea of mutual aid. And in these times of COVID-19, of course, I think it's important to think about this film as a really beautiful portrayal of mutual aid, kind of even across ethereal realms, not just within the physical world. And in terms of interdependency and collective care, and a community convening across time and space. And it's made me really think the last few days, as I've been thinking about how I want to talk about this film now, just within the pandemic, how we are convening now across time and space, right? And needing to, of course, take physical distance from each other, but all of these beautiful mutual aid projects that are happening. So if you could just advance the slide, Hope. So I wanted to just kind of conclude this on the heels of, the film being a portrayal of mutual aid, between these really beautiful characters, and now what I'm seeing in the world happening, especially in the United States, where we're really just at the foothills of this pandemic. And this mutual aid is largely needing to happen within the internet, but I think it's really important that we also think about it as this energetic exchange that's happening as well, of care and support. And one project that's gotten me really excited is project that Amit Deswardine and Trevor Ellison, in partnership with Tara J, are trying to raise $250,000 to help directly support vulnerable people vulnerable to COVID-19, specifically queer, trans of color, non-binary, and/or intersex, Black, Indigenous folks, and other LGBTQI people of color during this pandemic crisis. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to kind of acknowledge, yes, we're in this pandemic, we're sharing art, but it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. These we can think about this in terms of mutual aid also being these opportunities where we can collectively work together through the internet, but also through almost like a spiritual practice. And if I'll just conclude on this also last project that I've been really excited about as well, with the last slide, is that of course we know that a lot of people in prison are extremely vulnerable to the virus, and there's a social media day happening today actually where there's a social media campaign to grant clemency to people in prisons who are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19, who are maybe elders or immunocompromised. So this is happening both in New York and LA. So just a couple things to share, because I know a lot of people are watching today. And yes, that concludes my presentation on the film. And again, I'm just so honored to be part of this conversation today. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Elliot. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Emma Frankland. And yeah, thank you so much, Elliot, for sharing your work.
Hi, am I on? The radical act is to exist. The radical act is to be seen, to choose to allow others to see these radical bodies, to allow ourselves to heal is the radical act. We who are changing, we who invite trouble, we who have made a choice, we who sometimes waver, we who are here today, we who breathe. Welcome. Hi, my name is Emma Frankland. I'm an artist, a writer, performer. I'm white, I'm British. I'm from Cornwall, which is the bit of the UK that looks like a toe right down the bottom. Although now I live on a boat near Brighton, which is Britain's queerest city. I'm a parent and I'm trans. I make performance that is messy, celebratory, and often uses materials with transformative properties. And I often incorporate physical tasks as well, strenuous physical tasks into the work. I guess I wanted to just offer a slight content warning that some of what I'm going to be talking about will references violence against trans people and slurs used against trans people. Nothing explicit, but just a heads up. Hope, could I have the image of Rituals Inc., please?
Hey, I'm going to bring up the slides now, but just tell me, I won't necessarily be able to see the names of them. So just tell me.
Oh, okay.
Just tell me forward.
The one there's one where I'm jumping and I'm covered in ink.
Okay.
My project, None of Us Is Yet a Robot, has spanned the last 7 years, which has been a fairly wild time for trans community. And it celebrates trans bodies as well as, yeah, that'll do, as well as questioning politics around transition and trans lives. The title, None of Us Is Yet a Robot, came from a slur that's often used against trans people, often thrown against trans women particularly, that we are in some way, that there are biological women, and then by default there are non-biological women. And the title of the project came as a rejection of that, to say, we are all biological. None of us is yet a robot. The project contains 5 performance pieces which have charted my transition over the last 7 years, and Rituals for Change, which has been screened as part of this project, was intended as a celebration responding to my transitioning body. And I wanted to really celebrate the trans body in a way that often we see it, we see trans bodies as sites of violence or of controversy, and I wanted to celebrate the beauty and the magic of that. Hope, could you go to the one with ink, please? Rituals for Change was also a response to the strong presence of ritual in trans culture. Trans people were your clerics, your witches, your healers, and in the long tradition of societally non-conforming people, we were your performers. For many trans artists, the lines between performance and ritual action are still very close, and Rituals for Change was exactly that, a collection of 5 rituals. Maybe can you take the picture down again? And I'll have me. I've often spoken about duty of care. When I was younger, I used to work in a swimming pool as a lifeguard. I was a lifeguard in a swimming pool, not like a Baywatch lifeguard on a beach. And one of the things that you had as a lifeguard is a duty of care, which is that you agree essentially, okay, I've learned this skill now. This skill is how to rescue you if you were drowning. And my duty of care is that I will use that skill even when I'm not getting paid to do so. And I really loved having that. It made me feel special and like I was offering a service, I guess. And something that I continue to return to in my practice is the question, what is the duty of care of an artist? And I think that what I mostly settle on is that the duty of care of an artist is to reflect the world as we honestly see it. That doesn't mean we have to talk only about the negative things or the things that affect us negatively, but I reserve the right to make silly, joyful work as well. But I do think we must be honest about that work. And more recently, I've been questioning as well, what's the duty of care of the trans artist in this time and in these places where we are? I believe in the role of an artist is essential to a balanced society in this time, and certainly in the UK over the last few weeks, we hear a lot about key workers, referring to the people working in our health system and driving deliveries and keeping us all alive and healthy in this time. And I wonder about how we can frame artists as key workers and that we deliver something essential as well. I also believe in the role of trans people within a balanced society. I think we are essential, and I think we are out of balance. And as society, we have been out of balance for some time. I want to belatedly give thanks to everyone who's organized this project and brought us all together. And also just to kind of comment on the other artists' films. It was been so wonderful watching the films and the photography and seeing this incredible trans art that none of which seems to me focused on serving a cisgender gaze, not working on the job of explaining what are trans people. And that's something that's been that's something that was remarkable to see. I think it's important to resist exceptionalism. I think the world wants to celebrate individual celebrities, and there's been a real drive over the last few years to create trans celebrity. You know, can I be the first trans person to achieve this, or the first trans woman on the moon, or whatever. And I think that often that leaves behind a lot of people, and it's much more important to situate ourselves in abundance and to stand in solidarity and to acknowledge what has gone before and all of what all of the things that have happened, the people that have existed that give us the privilege to be here today, to resist the urge to be a pioneer, because the pioneers were assholes, right? So I'm very excited for trans art in this moment and going forward. Okay, trans, what's the other word? Revolutions. Okay, I'm excited for that as well, I guess. Hope, could I have the image of me with the axe, please? I was on a panel the other day and the question came up of why should we make art? And there's a quote from the front of Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Pleasure Activism, which comes from Tony Cade Bambara, which says that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I kind of like that. But it also makes me think, this word, about how revolutions come full circle, like cycles. And one of the things that has excited me as my body has changed with the magic of estrogen and hormone therapy has been the emergence of a kind of cycle. And I think that it's important to recognize that trans people have a cycle as well, which is a cycle of acceptance and oppression and often violence. And we see this cycle playing out all around the world, often not in sync with one another. We may experience a moment of acceptance while somewhere else there is a moment of violence happening. The last few years, certainly in English-speaking Eurocentric cultures, we've seen a wild shift in the place of trans people in society from, really being very underground through to this kind of weird acceptance that happened a couple of years ago, where we were all sort of celebrated as being plucky survivors and heroes, through to now, where in the UK, where even during COVID-19 crisis, where you might think people have better things to think about, our media is still attacking us, particularly trans women, every day. And we're crazy if we think we are more secure now or we are better than people in the past. Which brings me to my most recent work, Hearty. Hope, maybe could you bring up the slide of Hearty? Because I've really spent the last 3 years performing the apocalypse. So how, I guess the joke is on me that we find ourselves now in a kind of apocalypse, although that wasn't the one that I was talking about. And this show brings a warning, a reminder that these cycles of violence and genocide are not only historical fictions, but the nature of a cycle is that sooner or later we're going to encounter it again. It's a warning against growing complacency, against increasingly frightening legislation that is removing our civil liberties and seeking control of our bodies. Stay frightened, I say in the show. Get ready. In Hearty, again, I took a slur and I attempted to reclaim it. Here I'm wearing a shirt that contains a slur from Jermaine Greer, who said, just because you lop your dick off and wear a dress, it doesn't make you a fucking woman. Late one night, I painted "Lop Your Dick Off" in large black and red letters on an old piece of board. As with previous shows, I felt that the system was trying to define me by my anatomy, and I wanted to reclaim the statement as a position of power and positivity. I wanted to say, yes, lop your dick off, but let the dick be both metaphor and reality. Let the dick stand for privilege and white supremacist patriarchal power, and let's lop that off and dispose of it in an act of civil disobedience that could change everything. And that slogan became the slogan for Hearty, and we even made the t-shirts as merchandise. I think we need a slogan we can all get behind in this time of revolution. I think a burning question I have is how we will continue to look after each other, the other side of this, this crisis we're in right now, and how we'll protect the more vulnerable members of our communities. And I think how we can resist the circle closing again. And the question of what are we leaving behind, which brings me to We Dig. Could I see We Dig digging, please, Hope? There was a conversation I had in Brazil with a trans person there a few years ago who said to me, could I have the one of us all digging together, please? Who said that we're in an apocalypse and all we can do is to bury our knowledge until that apocalypse passes. And so I've been returning to the idea of digging and burying and asking the question, what are we leaving behind, and who is going to be uncovering it? And oh, I throw myself. What are we going to leave behind and who's going to be uncovering it? And I think that's where art is essential. And I think that's where archiving is essential and sexy. And I'm grateful for this growing body of trans art, which seeks not to explain ourselves to the world or justify our place, but communicates to each other and to those who are going to inevitably come after us. So I choose abundance and not being seduced into a desire for respectability, which I think is the last thing that we all need. And I'm excited with the work I'm making going forwards to work with larger groups of trans people, to not just be solo work. This image is an incredible collection of trans femmes who we all came together from all around the world, from Indonesia, from Turtle Island, from the UK. And we came together to demolish a theatre and to dig a hole. That project, We Dig, it had a cast of 6 trans feminine people performing. We had a guest performer every night, which meant that over the course of the run, there were 16 trans feminine performers. We had a company of trans people backstage as well supporting it. And I'm excited going forward to see what happens when we can make our art from that place. Hearing multiple voices, supporting complexity and difference. Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here.
Oops. Thank you so much, Emma. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Tourmaline. So thank you, Tourmaline.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I feel really honored to be part of this conversation with artists and thinkers and just people in general who I have admired for years now, who have really deeply influenced my own work. And I really also feel thankful to Hope and Heather and everyone who really came together to make this happen in a way that is accessible in a moment of pandemic and shared illness, and is leading with the kind of care that we want, the dream of being together across distance, spending space and time. And I feel really grateful to be a part of that. I wanted to open with, basically I'm gonna read a little bit. I'm gonna read some things that I wrote for today, and some things that other people wrote about moments of shared illness, about moments of being in the mess of a thing and still finding joy, about ways that we come together all the time, bending space and time across great distance, about isolation, and about dreaming together, dreaming out the world that we want to live in, not even making the world that we want to live in, not even having to do action other than dream. And so to me, that's what I'm feeling really called to put my attention on and what I wanted to offer right now. It's also reflected in the work that is shared online. So both Salacia and Atlantic of Sea of Bones have a theme of being in the midst of shared illness, whether it is post-1834 cholera epidemic that killed over 3,000 New Yorkers in 1 week, where in Salacia, the film following the story of Mary Jones follows really shortly after, or the criminalization of HIV transmission and the HIV and AIDS epidemic with Atlantic as a Sea of Bones. Both of these moments are moving through my work. And I think also, I just think about how timely these conversations are with the Department of Justice talking about criminalizing the transmission of COVID-19. I think that it's really a really wonderful invitation for us to all think about shared illness, contagion, and debility, and sickness and death in ways that we want to continue to foreground our knowledge, our deep knowledge that comes from disability justice communities, that comes from lives of being entangled with illness and death, and not from necessarily what the state is telling us about how to deal with contagion. So what I'm going to open with is a quote from Sylvia Rivera, who in an essay called The Queens in Exile, The Forgotten Ones, in a book from Genderqueer, talks about meeting Marsha P. Johnson, who me and Sasha Wurtzel made a film about called Happy Birthday, Marsha. And Sylvia talks about meeting Marsha and the kind of care and study that they were engaged in. So it starts with, then one time I was walking across 6th Avenue, New York City, and she was standing there in the corner. She called me to her side. We introduced ourselves, and a very strong sistership was born. She took me out to eat. She was standing there hustling, even though she was working as a waiter at Child's restaurant. But she always had to make extra change, as she always said. And later on, we would see each other at the clubs or at different gatherings. She knew my first lover and came back to my apartment out in Jersey. We stood by each other, had each other's back for many years. And even in the pre-days of Stonewall, pre-Stonewall, we would sit on 44th Street. A lot of us girls like Marsha and Vanessa and Miss Edwina, Miss Josie, a whole bunch of us would sit in a room we'd be getting high or something, and we'd start talking about politics. We'd start talking about politics and about the things we were going to change and how we were going to change them for us as human beings. And to me, I think that quote I keep coming back to because it's about us being together in the mess of a thing, in moments of heightened violence, and giving ourselves permission to study, to ask questions, even if they're the same questions every day, about how to change things, and then to dream, to know that dreaming is enough. More and more, I've come to understand the importance of gathering together and dreaming, especially in a time of fear and shared illness. I think about the joys of being together with each other remotely, and I also think about the violence of isolation and how it affects so many of us. Those of us who are Black and queer and trans and gender nonconforming, who are non-binary, disabled, low income, those of us who are constantly navigating borders, who are sick in prison, jails, and detention centers, or can't work from home. In moments like these, where many of us are physically distant yet striving to be together, I remember that isolation is also so important to maintaining oppression. Because when we are together, whether it's digitally like right now or physically in moments not right now, we are powerful. And we're powerful when we try to make sense of the world together. And for those of us who already had a time getting outside before this moment, or going to work, or had been asking employers to be able to work remotely for a very long time, I want to bring our knowledge into the room and say, we are powerful even when simply breathing has been enough of a task. Together this afternoon, we are creating community that goes against the norm, against structures that created those norms, against the internalized messages about what is valued, who is valued, and how we value each other. And I appreciate all the labor that went into pushing back against, those notions of what it means to be together. I want to talk about value and care and being ourselves, or put another way, working from our own condition. I want to talk about how we all, including myself, in order to be in this virtual room together, already refuse power's grasp and continue to make a way out of the no way we're constantly offered. And I want to say that being ourselves and being in our condition in this moment of increased violence and fear offers tremendous possibility for transformation. So many of us depend on another person to reflect back who we are and how we need to be seen, from our preferred pronouns to our access needs being known as legitimate. And I'm also here to say that that dependency is one of our greatest sources of power. This is also at the center of my film work. A few years ago, my friend Park MacArthur and Tina Zavastanos gave a performance called It's Sort of Like a Big Hug in Scotland, and offered a few questions for the audience, including, can debility be loved, not managed, accommodated, altered, or rehabilitated, tested? Can debility be loved? Can debility be represented and representative of conditions other than crisis, failure, and collapse? So that was Park MacArthur, and Tina Zavastanos put it another way. What would it be like to start making work about our own condition? What would it be to start making work about our own conditions instead of what I think we really do, which is work through and with our conditions about something else? I was really sitting with these quotes, and then I came across something that Angela Davis said, which was, I think our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. Self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension, all this is now part of a radical social justice struggle that wasn't the case before. And I think that now we're thinking deeply about the connection between interior life and what happens in the social world. Even those who are fighting against state violence often incorporate impulses that are based on state violence in their relations with other people. So I think I'm thinking a lot about, both Angela Davis's quote and Tina Zavastanos and Park MacArthur, because some days, and this is one of them, I really just need to sit with the messages that we're receiving about being in our own condition, and the messages that tell us that if we're having a hard time, it's our fault. because ableism and anti-Black racism and transphobia are over because legislation has been passed against them, right? So in this moment of huge contradictions where we have a strong desire to be with each other and we are met with strong messaging about, if we're having a hard time, it's our fault, I look for art and I look for the pleasure of being together. And for me, that was a bit of a journey. It wasn't until my coworker, Gabriel Foster at the Sylvia Vera Love Project, gave me a paradigm shift that we can't just lead with gloom and doom and talk about the bad things that have happened to us. As Black trans people, we live that and know all about it. We need to also incorporate what we do want. And in a moment of contrast to how much, our desire of how we want to be is, we want to be living how we want to be living and feeling. Being in my own condition personally means reaching for joy. And that's, how I'm leading back to my film work. Joy in the mess of a thing. Because in our laughter, in our coming together, in our ease, in our great joy, we unlock the possibilities for even deeper transformation. That's my condition. In our ease, we access our dreams that lay the foundation of what comes next. And Atlantic is a Sea of Bones and Salacia are really about that, the two works online. They're about characters who have a powerful and clear intent, who say that we can be together in this hard time, we can come together and still access joy. And that joy can be in deeper service to the world, right? That joy allows for us to give more, to be all of who we are. So for instance, in Atlantic is a Sea of Bones, that film came out of work that I was doing when I was part of the Audre Lorde Project's Trans Justice campaign around ensuring access to welfare and HASA, HIV/AIDS benefits for trans and gender nonconforming people of color who were constantly met at welfare offices and told, no, come back when you look like a man, or no, come back when you look like a woman, and couldn't access the little bit of benefits that we needed to survive. When I was doing this work, Egypt LaBeija, my friend, who was the coordinator of Trans Justice at the time, did, we had Tuesday study sessions, similar to how Sylvia and Marcia were hanging out in the hotel room with Miss Edwina and Vanessa, talking about politics, talking about when things were going to change. Me and Leilani in Egypt would meet every Tuesday and talk about that. And then one day, Egypt came in with this big coffee table book about, life in the New York City's meatpacking district in the 90s. And she was talking and flipping through it and showing all these beautiful photographs about, the kind of sociality, the kind of joy and pleasure people, including her, were having in that moment. And then she also talked about how every single person in the book, other than her, had died from AIDS-related illnesses. And so she was talking about what it meant to carry that loss, to still be alive in a moment of so much loss. And then she started talking about how she was never asked her permission to be photographed in this book. So we started talking about how losing so much is inextricably linked to having our aesthetic, our image being taken from us without permission. And then we started talking about, well, what would it look like to create an aesthetic project that was really in service to healing around that, really in service to offering something back to that moment. And that's where Atlantic Sea of Bones came out of. At that time, every day I was listening to Alexis Pauline Gumbs reciting Atlantic is a Sea of Bones, which is a Lucille Clifton poem. And every day after work, I would just go and look at Alexis's Vimeo and just listen to Alexis read that poem, which is really about the possibility of transformation when we are listening to violence that is haunting a landscape, from historical traumas that happened hundreds of years ago to you know, what the criminalization of HIV and AIDS and the loss of so many of Egypt's friends. And those things, those issues were and continue to be so entangled with each other. And so what the work of Atlantic Sea of Bones, and also Salacia, but just to specifically talk about Atlantic Sea of Bones right now, is really about is being in that entanglement, listening to it, not running away from it, knowing that when we listen to the things that haunt us, we can be fully in our power, right? When we're speaking and holding space for large violences, that means we're doing it to be in service to each other and ourselves around healing. And so to me, that's what the joy of filmmaking is about, right? It's about noticing what's already surrounding us, the abundance, those scary things that aren't scary for the point of making us feel afraid, but are scary for the point of asking us to stop burying them, stop burying our condition, right? To know that when we hold those scary moments, we're also holding our abundance of care, our abundance of support, the abundance that surrounds us, that we can bathe in, which is trans people and trans joy in our everyday lives. And that's happening also right now in the midst of this pandemic, from resource sharing and mutual aid to food and art making, to making out, to serving looks on Zoom, to inspiring laughter. So many of us are coming together to meet this moment with everything that we've got. And I really want to close with just thinking about that, how in the midst of so much that contrasts how we want to feel, there is also so much of us coming together to offer solutions, right? To put forward what we do want, to put our focus on what's already there, as Gabriel Foster so helpfully reminded me to, which has always been a part of the Black tradition, right? Of noticing how, yes, we're in the midst of a mess of a thing, but we can still find joy and humor anyway. So I want to close with a quote, another one from Park MacArthur and Tina Zavastanos, which is something that I've been moving through these past couple of days with, which is, one day we will work only for free and only for each other. Our revolution is not apocalyptic, but apostrophic, aligning even the negative spaces into folds and positive wholes, stacking debt up as supportive columns, counting those who carry with us, those who hold us, our spines, on our backs, in our surplus, as our means in mass and many. The calypso will carry us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tourmaline, and thank you all for sharing your work. It's been such a privilege and a joy to listen to you all speak today. So I thought actually, first I would love for you all to have a chance to, can you hear me okay? Okay. A chance to talk with one another and respond. There were so many points of continuity in the different remarks that and visual works that you shared. So I want to give you all a chance to talk with one another a little bit, and then depending on how we're doing on time, we'll open it up for some questions. Thank you. Or if nothing's coming to mind, I can offer some starting points, but I'm sure you have things that you'd like to say to one another as well. So yeah. Oh, Vic, let me see. Vic, I think you're muted. Is everybody, yeah, okay.
Okay. I'd like to, I didn't actually get around to saying something about just thinking about, I think people kind of talked about this, about about the responsibility of an artist, right? And I think that in this time right now, I think that some people, it's a good time to sort of reflect on like how we can help or how we can like take care of ourselves, right? And something that's coming up for me is, you know, a feeling a really large just like sense of, you know, like sadness. And I think that there's a way that I feel like, you know, I can kind of counter this, and it's like to like being of service, right? Like how can I be of service? And there's like one thing that's sort of been coming up frequently, and it's like, you know, masks, like, you know, making masks. That's a way that I feel like I can, as a maker, contribute. So I want to say that there's this website that people, since we have the platform right now, I felt like I you know, just use the platform for this, is like Western Mass, it's DIY, Western Mass mask makers. Let me just verify that. So it's DIY Mask of Western Mass. If people want to go on there, I know that it's not just for Western Mass. There's actually a database that's in there that can give people places and kind of connect people and makers together so that people can create masks. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Thank you.
I've been so grateful today for everybody's work. I mean, I spent earlier on, I went into the world because I had to, because I'm helping my neighbor who's a vulnerable person. And so I was collecting some medication for him. And I timed my journey wrong, and I had to sit kind of out for an hour waiting for the pharmacy to open. And I was feeling so anxious. I'm feeling a lot of anxiety going out into the world, which is not something as a trans woman I'm unfamiliar with, but there's a kind of intensity around it at the moment, and certainly a kind of real return to maybe how I was feeling, like, I don't know, a long time ago at the beginning of my transition, walking around and this sort of fear of the virus and the situation we're in. But I sat today and I watched I watched through the films while I was there, sat out in the world. And I do really value this thing that has come up in a lot of what everyone's been saying today about how in this time, how can we be of service to each other, and how can we lean on each other? And yeah, just acknowledging that the work that you're all putting out is so healing and so helpful. And I'm really appreciative that this platform is now available more broadly, because one of the things I think as a live performance artist, it's hard to access online space in a way that isn't less good than the live event. And so I think making work accessible, a digital platform is a lot more accessible than a theater performance oftentimes, but it's hard to get that right. And so I'm really grateful that this work and this conversation is available here today.
So let's see. Emma, I know you brought up the revolution of the panel title, or the symposium title, which was in part because in conjunction with the Center for the Humanities theme of revolution at Wesleyan this year. But I guess I'm wondering, and this is a question for everyone, the ways in which, thinking about whether or not revolution is a useful term for you, or a way that you think about aesthetics or trans aesthetics, if that's how you would describe or sometimes describe your work. And related to that, I'm struck by the way in which reconfiguring and reimagining and perhaps excavating different temporalities and geographies and scales and speeds are so critical to each of your projects in different ways, from what you produce, the film, the photograph, the performance, but also all of the work and collaboration, forms of sociality leading up to the practice part, leading up to the work. And so I know people writing in, and my students as well, are thinking about how both the work that you're doing anticipates and has long been sort of aware of and prepared for, I suppose one could say, this moment, and also how you're thinking about making work in forms of relation, the virtual versus the physical, and if those things are, if you see your work as already kind of disrupting those sorts of notions or ways of thinking about space and relation. Or if you have other thoughts that you'd like to, other responses to one another's work.
I guess I'll speak on that, Heather, briefly. I've been thinking just in terms of like how we share work, not just in the act of making work, but also then the life that it lives outside of the studio or our computers, and then the conversations that we imagine it having. And I have been planning to like make another film. And of course, a lot of it's shifting because of what's happening in terms of just being able to go to particular places. And I'm privileged enough to live in a place where I can walk outside, you know, and I can access nature. But I think I'm thinking in particular about like works that, you know, like the film that I just made, and then how it was supposed to, it's basically supposed to play the festival circuit now. And a lot of these events are getting canceled. And, you know, it's allowing me to really rethink the platforms that we hold validity through, in terms of like filmmaking, and like, oh, you've got to play at festivals, you know, it's really important to like represent your film. And in a way, like, I think there was this grief of then not having it premiere, you know, and having everyone put so much time into it. But then when the Symposium came online, and when I think we all collectively were like, yeah, actually this sounds really, really great. It sort of reinvigorated the film in a way. And this really was the first time it was shared widely with people. And it totally wasn't what we were expecting. And I think it's then like going to encourage like us to rethink how we want it to live in the world, even when it's not in a pandemic, in terms of just accessibility and how the work wants to live on its own. And I like to think of it almost as like having a life after, you know, I think every phase of work, like there's a death to it, and then you invigorate it with film, you know, you write the script, and then and then you have to let go and shoot it, and then you have the footage, and then you let go and it's edited. You have to kind of let go of what your own expectations were and allow the film to be what it wanted to be. And so it's kind of this really beautiful moment, I think, to surrendering to that process, and then allowing then the world to share in that process of the work as well. And when then it can invite other people into its own process. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think this Symposium going virtual really reinvigorated my own relationship to the film that I had made and not yet shared yet. And I'm actually really excited now about the potential of it in these times.
Can I say something about revolution and status, I guess? That something that I like, Texas, you were saying about your image hanging above the fireplace and being blown up huge. And, you know, Tourmaline, you were talking about the coffee table book. And I think, you know, here we all are albeit in a more accessible platform, but still this invitation from a academic institution. And I'm excited about seeing trans art. It's not even infiltrating, because it's deserving of being in these spaces. Because I want the work to be accessible, but I don't want that to be
I think, by the way, it's Texas Isaiah, or TI for short is fine. I have two first names.
Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I think I often think about, in terms of my work, the placement of it within museums and galleries, because, you know, there's something about it for me that, you know, I was actually preparing to display some works at a gallery in New York City. It was going to be of all Black trans people. And one of the beautiful things about the gallery is that it looks like a home. And so the way that I approached the show was like, you know, if I were to live in this space, what images would I want on my walls? And they would be of Black trans people, you know, that image of Raquel over the fireplace, an image of Tourmaline, maybe like, you know, somewhere in my living room, like, you know, but also knowing that those spaces are also restricted because not a lot of Black people, brown or indigenous folks sort of walk into those spaces in general, you know? And then that sort of goes into the ideas of, you know, where do collectors, you know, what place do collectors have within my work in terms of, if I'm to sell a work, yes, you know, traditionally the percentage goes to the gallery and to the artist. The way that I divide things up is that it actually, a percentage also goes to the sitter. Because what does it mean for Black trans images to be consumed, but that person has no money in their bank accounts or can't afford dinner that day, you know? So just rethinking ways to sort of funnel money back into the community through these spaces, but also, yeah, just feeling a little tension with it, you know, because I don't want the works to only exist in galleries and museums, but also I want it to exist out on the street, and I want it to exist on digital platforms. But, you know, I also question like how accessible are those spaces, you know, because there's going to be at least one person that doesn't have access to go to that museum, or doesn't have a computer to go onto, or doesn't have an Instagram account. And so I'm always just figuring out ways, yes, to make the work more accessible. And then I also think like, does access, and I hope I'm phrasing this in the correct way. So I think that within what I'm thinking about is like, if works are to be in museums and galleries, usually, you know, works are based off of galleries, usually editions, so edition out of 5. What would it mean to, you know, do a print sale and have an image of Raquel out of 30 sell for maybe 70% cheaper than the actual museum price, and have it go to a lot of people who would enjoy that work? But knowing that if I were to go that way, then maybe the percentage that she would get would be less than if the work were to sell through a gallery. And so I don't know if that made sense, but I think I'm just trying to also think about like how to take care of, you know, myself and, you know, the people that I photograph financially, in relation to accessibility as well, where everyone can have access to work.
So I've got a question. Let me see if am I muted? Yeah. From the audience, and it's in relation to when Elliot, when you were talking about creating a collaborative space and eliminating or adapting the traditional hierarchical system of filmmaking. And so the questioner is wondering if you all broadly could speak about how you've gone about making collaboratively and redefining the creative space, what it is, where it is, perhaps when it is. That's something that you'd be interested in engaging.
Does anyone else want to speak to that, since I sort of spoke to it within my own talk? Just to give other people an opportunity.
A couple things. I think to me, you know, it comes back to the last conversation that we were having about where to show work. And the way that I'm approaching it right now is so similar with, you know, what everyone was saying, which is showing it everywhere, right? Like, yes, it's in the museum, and yes, it's in the home, and yes, it's on the street, and yes, it's online. It's, you know, for a long time, I was always trying to find, like, what is the one best space? And then I realized, oh, it's actually a double Dutch. Like, I'm out and in, and out and in, and out and in, and out and in. You're showing it everywhere. We're showing it everywhere, and we're doing it all the time. And it's on my body, you know, like, I think that is what we're trying to say and put forth, is that all of these places, all of these spaces need us to show up with all of who we bring and all of who we are. And then in terms of filmmaking and collaboration and collective, you know, the first film that I ever made was with my friend Kagendo and part of the Welfare Warriors, which was a group that was in Queers for Economic Justice. And that started in 2007 and we finished in 2009, and you can watch it online. It's on Kagendo's page. Kagendo actually died a couple of years ago. And but the film lives on. It's called Taking Freedom Home, and it's about us who were and are low-income, gender non-conforming, non-binary, queer, and trans people, mostly people of color, who came together to ask each other, well, what are the ways that we survive? What are the ways that we support each other? What are the ways that we take care of ourselves? What are the ways that we still find joy? What are the ways that we're playful about it? What are the ways that we mourn the very real loss that we have? And what are the ways that we are no longer using, like, the hard times we have had to go through to justify the really hot and sexy and beautiful things that we have now, right? What are the ways that we're putting the focus on ease? And we did that, and it was beautiful. You can watch it on Vimeo. It was like this wonderful experiment of collective filmmaking where we all were the DP, we were all the cinematographer, we had all the angles, we were showing up with all of us. And, you know, to me, I used to not talk about that film ever because I was like, oh, I don't really like how I look in it. And, you know, it's like, it's a particular moment in my life. And I was a, you know, organizer. And now I talk about it all the time everywhere. And I want everyone to watch it because it was using the tools that we had, right? Like this is before even camera phones. This was like, we were really using the tools that we had. And it looks like it. It looks like we were using the tools that we had in order to tell our stories and find the pleasure in that. And it's so beautiful. It has this kind of like early internet aesthetic going on, and early, even though it's 2009, which is kind of confusing, and it has this early internet like soundtrack and just the graphics, and it also is really clear about the things that needed change, right? We talk very forcefully and clearly about some of the obstacles and challenges that we're having. We talk very forcefully and clearly about some of the ways that we're leading to dismantle those. And we talk very forcefully and clearly about the world that we want, that we're growing and dreaming all the time. And so to me, Taking Freedom Home was one of the ways that I double Dutch, right? Like sometimes I want to be part of a group, not in charge. Other times I know that I am the leader and that is what I want to be doing. And sometimes it's both, right? Sometimes I'm holding the camera, sometimes I'm on the other side of it. And to me, it's about this conversation that we were having before, which is how do we do it in all the abundance of ways, bringing all of who we are and all of who we're with all the time. And it's an experiment. And I think it's a really beautiful thing. And sometimes you know, we are in process around it and we haven't found the right thing, right? Sometimes we look back and we're like, oh, that didn't actually work so well, or, oh, I want to do more of this, you know, other thing next time. But to me, it's a long arc. Like, you know, Kugendo might not be alive right now, but the arc of her work is quite long, and it has its own life, and that is, you know, part of what I'm looking at right now.
Thank you. Maybe so Vic, you were talking about how your work has tended towards a kind of like slowing down or slowness. In Texas, Isaiah, I know that you have thought, or people who've participated in photograph making with you have thought about the pause, how sort of there's a narrative, but then the site of the making of the portrait is a moment of pause or stillness. And I would love to hear you all say more about how time functions in your work, and also if that, and this applies to everyone as well, of course, but and if and how you feel like that's shifting now, perhaps for you, or what, yeah, what the temporality of your practice is sort of looks like in this moment, if it differs in some way or continues from your prior work.
Sure, I can talk about that. I think that generally, I've talked about this a little bit more, but I can expand on it. Is generally, I think societally, actually, we tend to want instant gratification, and if it's not instant, then I think that we sort of tend to, I guess, turn our heads right and not engage. But I think what I hope of the viewer is to actually sit with the piece and really think about it. It's almost like an act of meditation. Yeah, it's and sort of a meditation, or sort of like calling the viewer to slow down and like really think about like what's going on in the work itself, or sort of referencing the work that I made with Seed on Seed, and you know, along the journey in this, there's all this architecture, and it's also like the relics of like Spanish colonial rule, as well as like integration of indigenous adobe homes. So I mean, if you just take time and you look at the architecture, or sort of the landscape itself, is you're able to sort of unearth all of these like types of like symbolism that's happening in it. So yeah, I guess it's just, I want people to, there's a sort of audience that I'm actually looking for to engage with the work. And I know that it's not for everybody, but I know that the people that I'm looking to have a dialogue with are people that are interested in these topics. And, you know, I also, something just going back really quick to talk about like, how other people have come in, how other people, this is also, you know, touching back on the subject with Tourmaline, talking about how other people live in your work, is there are other people that I've actually talked to, I've had long conversations with about the work, and asking other artists specifically, and also some of my mom as well, and family, and you know, they'll give me like insight, and you know, I take it because I actually really trust these people that I'm working with. So you know, it kind of goes against like the narrative of like the lone artist, you know, working and creating by themselves. I mean, it's far from that. I mean, I had a friend give me advice. Sam Ace gave me advice on how to like incorporate sound into my work, and it just, you know, it really actually is an embodiment of different queer people, you know, and also family. So yeah, that's what I thought I'd add.
Thank you.
I think I began to confront a particular kind of pause when I first came out to California And I found myself on a weed farm working for a couple of months, and it was my first time in nature, intentionally in nature. And I think growing up in Brooklyn, you know, we do have our parks, but that's not something that, you know, the educators that I had or even my parents were able to offer me for many different reasons. So I wasn't, and especially as a first generation individual, I wasn't connected to nature in any way. I didn't have that privilege at all. There was always something to worry about. And so I feel like a lot of the previous pauses in my work were really very much riddled in worry and depression and anxiety. There was no relief. When I look at that work now, I think it's important, but there was just no relief available until I came out here. And I think that for me, I had to experience that sort of relief of maybe making work that may be difficult, but knowing that there is, you know, a common at the end of that. And yes, you know, I think as artists, or, you know, whatever our journeys entail, you know, we do have to sort of engage with particular experiences, perhaps to make, you know, these kinds of works. And so if it were not for those experiences that I had in nature, you know, for months at a time, you know, I wouldn't have been able, or would not be able to approach other people or ask people to, you know, what would a pause look like for them within this moment. And I think, you know, when I engage sitters, you know, I always tell people, you know, photographing with me is like hanging out. We're just hanging out. It doesn't need to be this performance, you know. And attached to that, the images don't have to exist in public. You know, everyone that I photograph, they have a right to tell me, like, I don't want these images out in the public. Can we keep this private? And it's like, that's totally fine, you know, because I'm not creating this work to be consumed by everyone that is looking at it. I want the sitter to figure out like what they need within a photographic space. And that also is a desire of mine. Like, I'm also, you know, learning and figuring out like what I need from a photographic space as well. And so I think that sharing is incredibly important. But I also, you know, think of, you know, of course, like, you know, the narratives that are very prominent, you know, in media surrounding trans bodies. And for me, I want to create images that, you know, here's a trans person just like fucking hanging out at a park, you know, and, you know, just relaxing and doing nothing, or, you know, just, I want to produce those kind of images because I know that when we walk out into the world, it's very easy to forget that those things can exist. And I think, you know, producing, you know, these visual conduits of calmness and pause can perhaps, you know, make people question, you know, what a pause can look like for them, you know, within this moment or maybe in the future.
Can I say something about time? So within my work as a live performance artist, that liveness, that shared space is really integral to the shows. And so time becomes a kind of feature because it's this shared moment, and any performance that I've given of any of these works will never exists again and only exists in that moment. And that was something when we came to create Rituals for Change as a film, what really struck me was how different the timing of the film needed to be to the timing of the performance piece. And I think, you know, echoing that previous question and what Vic, what you were saying just then, something that I'm really grateful for is, although my work appears as a solo performance, my body's always been surrounded by many other exceptional artists, and is always very supported, and particularly with realizing the film, being supported by Rosie Powell and by Murat and Pharaoh, who were the other creative makers on that film, helping me to translate what I was very familiar with in a live space, but how to edit that and make it work for a different medium. And what happened was that some of those pauses had to become really fast, and some of them had to become stretched out, and it was very yeah, it's super interesting.
Thank you. So we're at 4:02. I know you all agreed to stick around maybe for another 15 minutes or so as questions come in. So while I look at that, if anyone, did any of you want to add to that while I look at the questions list? Okay, so one of the questions is about broadly about creating how to produce art amidst archival and structural absence, and how you're thinking about absence. And that made me think also of, Vic, you were talking about a kind of a sense of sadness in producing this, you know, in this sort of in doing work and existing in this particular moment. But then also you were talking about how, let me find it, the sort of the symbolism of things, like in your work, that certain like objects and spaces point outwards towards other time periods, histories, cosmologies, and I think that's true of a lot of your work. And so the way that I suppose for all of you, like objects can both mark presence and absence, or trouble the distinction between the two. And so I guess I would love to hear you all talk about that, and also maybe in relation to the ways your work also might be pushing back on particular kinds of interpretation or transparency or translation through objects. So Tourmaline, your work comes to mind, for example, if that's something that you would like to talk about, or Vic.
Yeah, will you tell me how it comes to mind?
Well, I was thinking about how you referred to water as being like a character in the film, for example. Yeah, that was one thing that came to mind. And also the use of like holographic technologies, or the way that the remnants of a pier kind of then come into conversation, perhaps with the bones and the Lucille Clifton poem and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's also always a cat.
Oh, awesome. My cats are absent for some reason.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that water to me is, so yeah, I mean, it's like, am I making the same movie all the time? And there's always a bathtub, there's always a cat, there's always a lot of water, there's like some kind of wonderful aestheticized, non-contemporary moment. I think to me, with that, I come back to Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts essay all the time, which is about really troubling this notion of the archive as some place that is outside of violence, that's outside of the kinds of ways that we're understood, we're taught to understand what truth is, right? So like the archive is produced in, reproduces, and fails to trouble so often historical erasure. And the work that I seek to make is about displacing the archive as this place of truth, and thinking about the stories that we get to be creative around inventing in order to speak to something that is much more true than often we find in an archive. And so Saidiya Hartman, you know, has this sentence I keep coming back to, which is, you know, about storytelling that, quote, exceeds the fictions of history that constitute the archive and determine what can be said about the past. I long to write a new story, one unfettered by the constraints of legal documents, because a lot of those times those legal documents and facts exist as obstacles to telling the stories of lives that navigate violence of historical erasure. And to me, that comes back to water also. Water as a place that is haunted, water as a place of transformation, water as a place that holds feeling, water as a site of the haptic. You know, I'm also a Cancer, so I'm always thinking about water in all the different kinds of ways. Shout out to all the Cancers on the Zoom. And in the audience. So yeah, I mean, I think that you know, with both Salacia and Atlantic City of Bones and Happy Birthday Marcia, water is really central to holding memory, right? Water holds a score, like we talk about the body holding a score. Well, the body of water that, you know, surrounds New York City definitely holds a score. The oceanic continues to offer tremendous like haunting possibility for transformation. And that's really a theme that just runs right through the work that I do. So thank you for the question.
Vic, did you want to say anything else about the sort of objects and absence presence, the way that the archive functions in your work and what you've referred to as kind of a queering of archaeology?
Right, right. I'm going to make it really quick because my computer is actually going to die soon, and I don't have necessarily electricity in the area. So yeah, I'd like to answer that though. You know, I can just say this is, I think that there's a lot of questions. I've been looking at like genealogy and trying to figure out where my family is from. And I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think there's several things that happen is because along the border, which is El Paso, Texas, and also north in New Mexico, there were people who were taken from Mexico, and indigenous people, and forced into slavery. And they actually were relocated along the border. So that's something that's happened. And I'm not sure, I mean, these are just like things that I'm wondering about in my work. And also there's also people who relocated, indigenous people relocated to the border areas because they were trying to escape the caste system. So, I mean, there's all this displacement, right? And there's also people from the area that were also just sort of, you know, they were all like mixed in to like a group, which is basically Chicano or mestizos. So this is like, I guess I'm just sort of trying to set the tracks for like how my genealogy is today. And something that happened not so long ago is my mom and her sister, her aunt, were actually talking, and they started kind of talking about words that were mysterious, and one not in the English dictionary, not in the Spanish dictionary. And these words, actually, I looked them up, and they're a Nawa, which is it's an indigenous language. It's an ancient language. So these are just sort of like ways that these like shards of like, it's like shards of like words are transferred in from a memory, right? And I think that they're not necessarily objects, but it kind of they can become they've sort of transitioned into my work and sort of symbolic of things that I'm making. And so the jump off is like the object, like as the corn, right? The corn is sort of a reference of indigenous culture, and corn is also, it originated in Mexico. It what scientists say. So I'm using this as sort of, a memory, like a memory that's like passed along. Like agriculture is something that my family also, it's like something that they've practiced for generations. So it's a way that I'm able to communicate like indigenous mythology and beliefs are through objects, right? So yeah, but yeah, I'm 3% right now, so I might be saying bye to everybody.
Okay.
Oh.
Thank you, Vic.
Before you go, I definitely want to thank you so much for participating. I have one more question I might put out there that's a kind of an attempt to bring together the remaining questions a bit. And so if we lose you, thank you so much in the meantime. Okay, so to try and bring these together, there's, so Tourmaline, you were saying that, that you think about creating this like an aesthetic project in the service of healing. And there are questions here about like how you all are dealing with or thinking about isolation and care work, and how perhaps the relationship or how you think something like trans temporalities together with isolation, if those are terms that you are thinking together. And finally, then also thinking about care work in communities, and like addressing and sort of centering the role of disabled, trans, and queer people of color in forming like disability justice and mutual aid practices, and how you're furthering that in your work. And yeah, I think those are maybe some of the kind of closing questions, or anything else that you'd like to say in our remaining time.
I'm finding it very strange to be in isolation. Something that I didn't suspect that I'm finding hard to hold on to is, I don't know, a sense, I realize how much of my sense of self is bound up with how I interact with other people on a day-to-day basis, whether that's in opposition or whether that's in support. And there's something about the last kind of week where I've mostly spent time in my tracksuit and not wearing makeup and, chopping wood and doing, I don't know, it's been a different way of living. And I think that if I think about how my transness and the isolation impact on each other, I've been struggling a little bit with just with being set in one place. And I really valued today putting on makeup and getting ready and like wearing shoes even to get ready. But even though you're going to see me from here to here, that I was wearing these shoes that made me feel really good. And so, yeah, there's something about, but what I value is the community that's around me, local, but also now, like, it doesn't matter where anyone is because everyone is reachable through a video call or whatever, and being, leaning on and being supported by the broader trans community is definitely something that that is important in this time. And I see more of my trans and queer siblings and friends acting and putting together fundraisers and volunteering and getting out and supporting the broader community, because of course we know how to do this, and I think that's something that's become really apparent the last few days.
You're back.
Hey.
Hi.
I missed you.
Thanks.
So yeah, I guess if anyone else would be interested in saying a bit about how, and this was kind of like a coping strategies kind of question from one of the audience members about being and making in isolation, or if indeed that is not sort of how you experience the what is being sort of framed as a very isolating moment or social distancing moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's really important that we're sharing strategies, and that also knowing that strategies that work for some aren't going to work for other people. For me, like, there were like weeks at a time in my life when I just like couldn't go outside because my agoraphobia was so intense, or my anxiety was so intense, or whatever was going on with my mental health was so intense. And this moment certainly calls back to that. And also, you know, for a while, be like, I haven't touched anyone in so long. And then, you know, Jean will like look at me and be like, what are you talking about? Like, you haven't touched anyone? I'm not someone, you know. And it's so interesting the ways that I like narrativize like being without, you know, because I'm actually, I'm with a lot, you know, like I'm with a lot of care that doesn't happen necessarily physically, but is always present immaterially. I'm with a lot of people who are checking in on me. I'm with the Jean, I'm with my plants, I'm with my makeup. Like, I loved what you were saying about makeup. Like, I did my hair yesterday for this call, you know what I mean? Like, my hair was colorful before and it's even more vibrant today. It's like we are calling upon a lot in this moment, and some of what I'm doing might not work for anyone else, you know. Like, I love that, you know, like NYC Inferno, which is like a sex party that happens here, is like, okay, let's all have like a jerk off Zoom call. And I'm like, that's exactly right. Like, that's the solutioning that we need right now. Like, we need all of it. We need all the nightlife, all the, you know, Inferno calls. We need all of the ways that we're having laughter and pleasure and joy in the mess of a thing that isn't often that different from the ways that we had it before we started to frame it in this particular way that many of us have been living through it for our whole lives long. And some of us never, who are on the internet, right? Because of, we might not be able to afford it, we might not have a computer, we might be locked up, like all of the many particular things. So I think that coming together around strategies is really, really important. And thinking about isolation, and also thinking of bending space and time, and also thinking about deviance. Like, part of transness for me is the joy of deviance, and like seeing how that's being cultivated in this moment in the abundance of ways. Like, sometimes it's not like being on the Inferno Zoom call. Sometimes it's like dressing up in a mesh outfit with all the windows wide open. Like, that might be the way of like being in this moment right now. And I think that we're all figuring it out, and it's messy, and it's becoming, and it's beautiful, and it's hard, but it's also really there is a wave of you know, I was texting with Arthur Jaffa, who is an artist friend of mine, and we were talking about Drexcia, which was you know, like this group in Detroit, and also this idea that many of the Black people who jumped over the slave ships in the Middle Passage went under into the water and built beautiful, you know, huge, like massive communities, right? Learned how to live underwater. And that the wave that we're riding right now it's huge, and it's immense, and it's not light, it's heavy, it's intense, but so are the solutions being born in this moment. So are the solutions being like dreamed in this moment. So is the pleasure and the joy that's being offered in this moment, and we're all doing it together all the time. So I think that your question is just one that is really important to think about, the abundance of strategies that might not work for everyone and might only work for one of one, but are also always happening right now.
Thank you. I think that might be a beautiful place to conclude, except not to conclude, because this will be, it's being recorded, and it'll be on BCRW's website. And one of the things that I hope, you know, going forward is that just as the symposium wasn't March 26th to 27th, and now it's hopefully not just March 27th, 2 to 4:20 p.m. And that we'll figure out ways to have it shapeshift and continue in all sorts of forms. And thank you again so much, Tourmaline, for the suggestion to go virtual with it, and to Hope and Eve for making that possible in such a short amount of time. It's definitely a testament to what folks have been saying about how the impossible is not really impossible, and people have been doing that work. It's just been framed as impossible in ableist frameworks of how things could and could not unfold, and what spaces could and do exist. So thank you all so much. for sharing your work. And I hope to see you in person before too long.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
Yeah, take care.